Can't hear me. Now you can hear me. Oh, now I can hear myself too. Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. You've got me first tonight, probably for about 20 minutes or so, and then on with the rest of the program. So I was given the small task by Merle to speak about women in Judaism, with Ruth as my starting point. And I thought this was a slightly daunting topic, both in the midst of such a knowledgeable community, but also just in general. And so I kind of narrowed it down to 3 points. Usually when I'm doing, if this was for my students and I was doing a lecture, these would have to actually flow well and come up with a different, flow well and make a story in the end. They don't. Instead, what I'm doing is 3 snapshots, 3 interesting parts. The first one about why I think Shavuot is actually a feminist festival. The second one on why I think Shavuot and the environment is so fundamentally important. And the third one, just a small midrash on women getting the Torah first, because it is the festival of the Torah. So I wanted to go into those 3 things just a little bit. And I wanted to start off with Shavuot because Shavuot really doesn't get a lot of airtime. We might know it as a festival that comes after Pesach. Those people who've been coming to shul every Friday might know it as the festival that causes us to have to count the Omer, which is an extra prayer, which makes the service a little bit longer. The 7 weeks of the counting of the Omer. And maybe we think of Shavuot as being linked to dairy. We just had a great dairy meal. And in fact, the very highly contested Beit Emanuel cheesecake competition, which had to be put as a cheesecake bring and share this year because of the highly contested nature of it. Yeah, Lael went into this a little bit, but I have been reading a little bit and wanted to go into it a little bit more. Does anybody know why, other than Lael's answer, that we eat dairy on, there are actually 4 reasons that we eat dairy on Shavuot. Does anyone want to go through some more of those reasons, other than Merle? And that was the one I was most surprised about when I was reading about it, was actually that we were given the Torah and that had all the rules and regulations of how we should be kosher. And our meat wasn't kosher. So we quickly had to come up with a different idea. So one reason is that we didn't have kosher food. We didn't have the rules and regulations and stuff of kosher food. The other one is... by eating milk was the Israel, and 2 answers there: Israel being the land of milk and honey, and the Torah being said to be our milk and honey, and eating the meat, and also this idea that this festival, and Lael referred to it, is also about a social justice and about thinking about people who are not wealthy. The other one that I really like is also linking to my theme of the environment. It's that this time in the pre-industrial world was a time when farmers would have had a lot of dairy and would have made a lot of dairy. And so there was a ready supply of milk. And so we eat milk. So all those reasons are why we eat dairy during Shavuot. And this brings us to the idea of linking Shavuot with the giving of the Torah, which is clearly an ultimately important thing, but something that I'm going to get back to. I want to look first at the feminist and the ecological. And from about the 1970s, you started to get quite a few people commenting on Shavuot, feminism, and ecology, and often in very different or diametrically opposing ways. On one hand, many of the commentators spoke about the fact that both the environment and women were oppressed by the same oppressor, the patriarchy. But on the other hand, there was the link of women and to the earth, Mother Earth. We think of Mother Earth. And I want to look at both of those, but I specifically want to use this to say that Shavuot is calling us to think about the earth and to think about the way in which we interact with the earth. And it's thinking about this through the book of Ruth. Now, Ruth is one of only 2 books. What's the other? I'm going to do this a bit like I do my classes. What's the other book that's the only other book in the Bible named after a woman is Esther. And the book of Esther, of course, which we read at Purim. And although it's another one of these feminist stories, it was never really my favorite story. And this year I did some learning with some Jewish friends of mine, and we started to learn about Vashti as a feminist symbol. And this is a talk for another time. But the fact that Vashti refused to dance for the king was a way of her actually standing up. And suddenly the story of Purim took on a whole new meaning. But as I say, story for another time. The book that we deal with today, the book of Ruth, is so important in terms of the idea of women at the center of the narrative. Not only does it place women at the center of the narrative, but it places women's relationships at the center of the narrative, women's kindness at the center of the narrative. It places a woman Jew by choice at the center of the narrative. And I think that these things are all really important for us to remember. Not only did Ruth, and we'll come back to that in the story in a few minutes, choose Judaism, but it also gives us the opportunity at Shavuot to choose Judaism again and again. It gives us the opportunity to choose, and at this time in our lives when it's very hard to be a Jew, it's important to be reminded of being a Jew, of choosing Judaism, that we all choose Judaism. The story, of course, of Ruth is about the story of Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, the two Moabite women who marry Naomi's children. And when the two sons die, Naomi says to her two bereft daughters, please go back to your land. And they make two different choices. And we always focus on the choice of Ruth because Ruth stays with Naomi. But I think it's worth mentioning, if we're going to look at Shavuot through a feminist lens, that Orpah also makes a choice. She chooses to go back to her people. Neither of these women have men in their lives anymore to tell them what to do. And they make two different choices, one to stay and one to go. And I think we should always remember that Orpah made a choice and that is important. Ruth, on the other hand, insists on going with Naomi back to Bethlehem and adopting Judaism as her own. And she makes the really famous proclamation saying, do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. And this exchange, I think we should always remember, is monumental. It solidifies Ruth as one of the most important Jews by choice. And it shows us again that women can make their own decisions. She's not beholden to anyone. She makes her own decision to devote herself to Naomi and to Judaism. And it's one of the things that I think is a real feminist moment. But also what's interesting is that there are other feminist moments in the story. Naomi and Ruth travel to Bethlehem, and they end up on a plot of land owned by a Jewish man named Boaz, who's Naomi's relative by marriage. And here we start to see the environmental link to the story. The way Ruth interacts with the harvest and the way Ruth interacts with the land tells us a lot about the environment. Ruth's first impulse is to join the harvest. And the lines are, Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, I would like to go to the field and glean amongst the ears of grain behind someone who shows me kindness. And here we see the metaphor or the idea of kindness coming back again, because Boaz notices Ruth and he learns from his servants that what she's done, that she's devoted herself to Naomi, that she's devoted herself. And so he gives her permission to take part in the harvest and to keep some for herself and for Naomi. And he acts with kindness to her, but she also says to him that it is amazing that he's recognizing her kindness. And it also starts the relationship between the two of them. And in some versions of the story, it's Ruth who asserts the right that Lael was talking about earlier for the poor to take the leftovers of the harvest. So we have this real story of these two feminist women. But if we look at the story as a whole, there are other women who play a role in it. There's kind of like a chorus of women from Bethlehem who comment on what Naomi is doing. But even the matriarchs, Rachel and Leah, and the brave and resourceful Tamar, make an appearance in the story, because the oldest tell Boaz when he's meeting and looking at Ruth, we are witnesses. The Eternal made the woman that has come into your house like Rachel and Leah. And he goes on to compare her to Tamar. And so in this book again, women are so seldom mentioned, and yet in this one story, women are the center and are mentioned. And it's Ruth who is interacting with the land. The story that we read is one that is about the giving of the Torah. And yet, if we look at the biblical stories, there is no real discussion of the giving of the Torah in the biblical stories. When we first meet this festival, it's the spring festival. And as Lael said earlier, it is spring somewhere in the world, although it doesn't feel like it much in Johannesburg. But in Exodus, we read about the festival of the first harvest, later clarified as bringing the first fruits. We meet the festivals again in Leviticus, where we talk about counting 50 days to bringing of the new meal, and that the sacrifice has to be the first fruits. In the book of Numbers, again, we meet a festival that is the day of the first fruits. There's much about the giving and receiving of fruit, much about the idea that this festival is linked to the environment, and that all of the fruit that we get is a gift to us from the environment. And we can link that to the giving of the Torah, the gift of the Torah, the gift of the environment, and of the sharing of the first fruits. There's nothing in the Bible about it being the gift of the Torah. The connection is really one about relationships. The relationships, or the beautiful relationships between Naomi and Ruth, between Ruth and Boaz, between humans and the environment, between God and us. We are replacing, in many ways, the ritual of bringing first fruit to the temple to acknowledge God's presence in our lives with a relationship of the giving of the Torah. And this calls for us to recognize where that relationship comes from, not just from giving of the Torah, but from the giving of the natural fruits of the world, because they teach us so much. And this teaches us that Ruth was ready to look after the environment. She tended to the environment just as she tends to the community. We can take from Boaz the story of welcoming the outsider, of granting her equality and letting her care for the land, in granting her the right over some of the harvest. We can consider that you need to treat the natural world the same as we would treat a person, that nature has given us so many harvests to celebrate, but if we don't look after it, we won't still be celebrating those anymore. And so I think that this story tells us so much from a feminist perspective about relationships and about the land. But I want to end with one small little detail about the giving of the Torah. And it's one before God revealed the Torah on Sinai, Moses had to tell the Israelites about the covenant. And only after that could there be an acceptance. In the end of the third verse that tells us the story uses a really interesting tautology or double language. It repeats the same idea twice using different words. Moses went up to God. The Lord called him from the mountain, saying, "Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob and declare to the children of Israel." So he's told the same thing twice. Talk to the house of Jacob and declare to the house of Israel. And I was looking to try to understand this and found this beautiful midrash from the time of the Mishnah that's attributed to Rabbi Yishmael, where he says that the wording of the house of Jacob actually refers to the woman, and that the women were told to get the Torah first because they were more reliable and were more interested in doing the mitzvot, and that the women would be given the Torahs first. And in fact, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs also points this out and points out that in 1917, there was the founding by Sarah Schneider of the first Bris Yaakov, the school for women, which was named after the verse, the children of Jacob. And from then on, from 1917, women took the place as central as Torah scholars. And I think that is also another really important point. So what I wanted to do in this brief time today was just to give you 3 little snapshots of why I think Shavuot is actually a really important festival, because it tells us about women in a central role in the Bible. It tells us about women's central role to one another. It tells us about women's central role to the earth. And it tells us about the fact that women have a role to play, not only in the background, but also in leading and learning Torah. And in a week where we heard that's Dina Roth has been ordained, in a week where I just came back from spending Shabbat with Rabbi Emma, in a week where we were just seeing Lael lead services, and we know how much Merle and Diane and everyone has done to keep our services going, and where we know about what Reva has done to keep the community going, and Ruth, and we have all these women in our community. I think this is a really important time to celebrate and to thank the women in our lives. Thank you very much.
I normally like to speak freely, but today I've got a bit of a presentation that was hastily put together, and I'm reading from notes, so I'm totally out of my element. Totally out of my element. Someone asked me, what is the topic about? Talking about a Nubian pharaoh, a Jewish king, and the Assyrian war machine. And it's about an era about 2,700 years ago, very little explored era in terms of history, and both history and our religion. At one point in time, it was a very popular subject. In fact, Prof will know that Lord Byron wrote about this in 1815, about the fall of Sennacherib. It was a very popular poem, and it was memorized. I remember my mother's mother memorizing this particular poem and reciting it. And so many other people of that generation knew the poem off by heart. But it seems that our generation has forgotten about it. And it seems that in terms of religion and commentary on religion, has forgotten about this little section. It's about King Hezekiah. Hezekiah, the Bible tells us there was no one like Hezekiah, no king like Hezekiah before him, and none like him afterwards, that he was the only one that was closest to David in terms of the belief. That's what the Bible tells us. 100 years later, it tells us that Josiah was very much the same. He was the only king that that was the only one that was like David. So it is about the question that I'm trying to explore here is Prof and myself and Scott read Torah and have been reading Torah for more than a year. And we found out that when we formalize the Torah, people do not participate. But when we try and do it in an informal way and try and do it from our understanding that there's an engagement in terms of this, and often in the past, the Torah would be read in Hebrew and no one would explore the text in English and explain what is happening. And I've mentioned to Prof. Williams before that we'd like to expand this to the Haftorah section as well. Of course, we read the Torah and we expand on it, but we never expand on the Haftorah section. And what we're about to explore often comes up in the Haftorah section. And when we do read the Haftorah section, we only read a few verses. We never read the full book of Isaiah or any of the prophets that is normally covered. So I'm ready. We can move on to the next slide. So I want to paint a picture for you and take you back to 2,700 years ago. It says in the northern summer of 701 BCE, the powerful Assyrian army, led by King Sennacherib, ravaged the Levant. Over a distance of 400 kilometers from north to south, it dealt with 70 states, which resulted in the deportation of tens of thousands of people. At least 13 walled cities had the rebellious kings replaced. He plundered the cities of Etekna and Timnath. He punished the nobles of Ekron and destroyed 46 Judean cities. He laid siege to the strategic military trading base of Lachish. The horrors of the siege, he carved into stone on the walls and the ceilings of the palace, so as to say, no one dare opposes Sennacherib of Assyria. And now he had Jerusalem in his sights. Indeed, Jerusalem seemed poised to meet the same catastrophic fate of Israel, suffered 19 years earlier. Syria's destroyed and deport strategy had then effectively extinguished a large portion of Hebrew society and culture from what had been the more populous of the two Hebrew states, where all 10 tribes were lost. It's not entirely true. Know in terms of history that the 10 tribes were not totally lost. A big percentage of them actually fled to Jerusalem, and we'll cover that as we go along. At that moment where it seemed all is lost to Judah and Jerusalem, the Assyrians retreat, leaving the city of David intact. The question is why? Why, when the superpower that was Syria, the shock and awe of its day was right to the gates of Jerusalem. It had already destroyed the entire Judah. It had already destroyed states in a 400-kilometer radius. It was standing at the gates, but did not besiege Jerusalem. Why has Syria, the only superpower, failed to seize Jerusalem? This mystery is one of history's greatest turning points and still resonates today. Why would history just turn the decision of one individual or one event that has impact today? Had Jerusalem fallen, Hebrew culture as a whole would have disappeared, meaning that monotheistic Judaism would not have been able to evolve centuries later. The slide that is up now, you can see the route that Sennacherib has traveled. So he travels past Jerusalem and comes back from the south to attack Jerusalem. And he's doing it for two reasons. He's trying to outflank the Egyptians, which he knows is towards the west. And he's attacking Israel from the south, or Judah from the south, because he knows if they flee, they would flee to the north. And that area had already covered. All his men are in position in that particular area. Had Jerusalem fallen, the culture as a whole would have been disappeared, meaning monotheistic Judaism would not have been able to evolve centuries later. Think of what that would mean. For without Judaism, both Christianity and Islam becomes inconceivable. And with these faiths, without these faiths, with 4.6 billion believers collectively make up 56% of the global population, the world as we know it becomes unrecognizable, profoundly and utterly different. So can you imagine that? Jerusalem at fall, we would not be sitting here today. We would not be sitting here today. We don't know what we would be worshiping, idols, spaceships, or whatever it may be, but definitely not what it is that we've inherited up to today. As if to reflect on this event's importance, the Bible tells us Jerusalem's deliverance 3 times in 2 Kings 18, Isaiah 36 and 37, and 2 Chronicles 32. No other biblical story receives such repeated discussion. So what does the Bible say happened? Can we have the next slide? Imagine on the night of the Passover, the Jewish people were staring annihilation in the face of overwhelming, implacable foe, completely surrounded Jerusalem, their last stronghold. There was a constant propaganda barrage against them from Sennacherib's messengers, demeaning them and their belief in Hashem, shouting not in the diplomatic language of Aramaic, but in Hebrew, so that within the city walls, everyone would understand what would befall them. The Jews had doubters from within. They went to sleep Passover night with no realistic hope. However, they woke up in the morning of Passover and the threat was suddenly gone. Someone had smitten the enemy. Each biblical narrative explains the climax similarly. The angel of the Lord slew 185,000 Assyrian troops as they slept in their camp. The survivors struggled home. So what do you do and how do you conceive history? History meets biblical narrative. Is that it? Is that what we all believe? God overnight sent the angel of death and struck down 185,000 soldiers? Or is there perhaps another part to this particular story? The sudden retreat of Sennacherib and the Syrian army is one of the most dramatic events in biblical history and one of the most studied of scholars over the years, as they have long sought to discern the historical cause behind what the biblical authors explain supernaturally. To try and unravel the mystery for those who find it implausible for an angel that slew the Assyrian army, we have to examine a bit of the history leading to the dramatic event. This is just what happened to the Israelites. They were all led into slavery, and you can see that that was typically the dress. Men would dress in a long robe. That robe would act as a blanket. Underneath, they had a thinner robe. So that robe would act as a blanket, and they could sleep wherever it is that they were. And you can see behind them the Assyrian soldier walking and basically pushing them on with a stick. And this is what was carved in the Sennacherib's walls and ceiling. And on the other side, you can see the Assyrian soldiers marching. Definitely the America of the day, struck every enemy of theirs with awe and with speed, the blitzkrieg of a century before. Next slide, please. So that's the angel of death, basically, is how it is portrayed in the paintings, drawings, and the imagination of many generations. Angel came at night and struck all of them. Can I have the next slide? This is how the map looks like in terms of the different religions. You can imagine that half of the world would have been believing in something else if Jerusalem fell. Can I have the next slide? Next slide. So that's a map of the Levant. The Levant, the coastal strip that borders the Mediterranean Sea, roughly from Syria to the north, to the fringes of Egypt, has for most of history been trapped between the mighty kingdoms of Egypt and numerous kingdoms that rose and fell to the north and east of the Levant, including the Hittites, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and indeed the Assyrians too. The coastal strip was a natural artery of trade and conquest, the crossroads of continents, where to the south lay the lucrative Arab trade of spices, and to the and the wealth of Egypt, and beyond Egypt, obviously the wealth of Africa and Nubia in particular, and to the west, the sea trade of the Phoenicians. For hundreds of years, leading up to the collapse of the Bronze Age, Egypt was the dominant power in this region. Archaeology proves that the Egyptians were stationed in the region and had a major influence on the culture of the Levant. So there's many things that we practice up until today that was influenced by the Egyptians in that region during the Bronze Age. In the late 11th century BCE, Egypt was on the decline and had relinquished the control of the Levant and retreated to the traditional boundaries as several pharaonic dynasties arose simultaneously contesting for the control of Egypt. It was in this period that many of the city-states in the Levant began to prosper, as they now had the control over the trade that was in the past dominated by Egypt. In the 10th century BCE, the 12 tribes of Israel were united by King David and his son Solomon. After Solomon's death in 933, the kingdom split apart and two mutually antagonistic states were formed. The 10 northern tribes formed the kingdom of Israel, and its capital eventually at Samaria. Judah and Benjamin, the two southern tribes, formed the kingdom of Judah and the capital in Jerusalem. So all these states, all Semitic-speaking states, prospered during that time because there was no power rising from the east or north, and Egypt had shrunk after the Bronze Age. And we know what happened in the Bronze Age. It was the time of the Sea People. They came and they invaded that area. And I think when Owen talks in terms of writing, his letters that were sent to Egypt from the time Egypt is a master, was letters sent on clay tablets to Egypt to say, we under siege and we don't know who it is that is attacking us, please help. There's also letters in that region showing kids doing homework on clay tablets, writing in Hebrew, so without the influence of Egypt. And you can see in the original Paleo-Hebrew, you can see some of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. So without the influence of Egypt, the writing would not have developed in that particular area. So Egypt played a major part in that area. So we see that the Levant's freedom came to an end with the rise of the expansion of the Assyrian empire in the 8th century. Assyria had humble beginnings as a trading outpost in the banks of the Tigris River in modern-day Iraq. They expanded from a small city-state through trade and conquest to the large empire that we see in all the yellow. You can see Syria as they conquered that area, not only to the south of them, conquering Babylon, but also to the west and south, right up to the Egyptian border. It is King Tiglath-Pileser III, who is mentioned in the Bible as Pul. In 745, consolidated and centralized the holdings of the empire, and through his military campaigns and conquests, more than doubled the extent of the Assyrian territory. The most significant conquest were bringing the entire Levant all the way to the Egyptian border under direct and indirect Assyrian rule, including Israel, Aram, Damascus, Judah, Edom, Moab, and Ammon, all began paying tribute to Tiglath-Pileser. Assyria's military and economic success was the strength of the administration, the use of the latest weaponry available at the time, the mastery of the siege warfare, the rewarding of those who willfully submitted to their will, and the brutal crushing and deportation of those who resisted them. So their strength actually came that they were the first ones to utilize iron weapons. An age where people utilized bronze weapons, which were dull, which was difficult to mine. In fact, if you look how wonderful the world was, that the trade stretched from modern day Pakistan and Afghanistan right through to the British Isles. They were getting tin from the British Isles. They were getting precious stones from Afghanistan, and they were mining copper in the desert. And that is where we get the story of the Jewish slaves, the ones that escaped and the ones that actually started the first form of writing. Under King Ahaz, Judah had become a protectorate for Syria, as he asked Assyria to protect Judah against Israel and Damascus. Damascus, because of the intervention, was overrun in 732, and 10 years later, the northern Jewish kingdom of Israel ceased to exist as the population was deported, and much of Syria and Palestine became Syrian provinces. Judah maintained the national identity, but it was effectively one of a number of regional satellite states paying tribute to Assyria. Judah under Syrian rule actually prospered. Because there was peace, there was calm, there was someone looking after their security, and they were allowed a bit of trade. It's the same reason why the kingdom of David could exist. In David's case, there was an absence of any superpower in that area, and so David could trade to the north in wood, and most probably trade to the west with the Phoenicians in other ways. At virtually the same time, you can change the slide. At virtually the same time that New Assyrian Empire was expanding, there were stirrings deep in Nubia. The Bible also calls Nubia Ethiopia and Cush. So these are often the translations that we see: Ethiopia from the Greek, and Cush, the original word from the Hebrew Bible. Cush, Egypt was in disarray. There were three pharaonic dynasties ruling Egypt at the same time and fighting amongst themselves. King Panki or Pai, the king of the Kushites, took advantage of Egypt's weakness and conquered Egypt in 744 before the Common Era. Effectively, he collapsed the 22nd, the 23rd, and the 24th dynasty, thereby establishing the 25th Pharaonic dynasty. So we're not sure of the 30 Egyptian dynasties that existed, how many of them were black, but we're certain that this one was, because it was recorded so. The Kushite power in Egypt was consolidated under Pi's brother and successor, Shabako, in 716, who initiated trading contact with the cities of Palestine and the Levant. Needing a buffer and fearing competition from Assyria, the only other major military power which could control the Levant, present-day Jordan and Syria, Israel, Lebanon, and Palestine, Pharaoh Shabako stirred revolt amongst the city-states to resist being a vassal nation to the Assyrians and implicitly promised to defend them in the case of war with Syria. Having extended trade in Egypt and the Levant for the first time in over 200 years, it was inevitable that the combined Egyptian Kushite empire would clash with Assyria. So it was set up for war. And this photograph shows where, how deep in Africa the Kush Empire, the Nubians existed, and they still exist. In fact, I dealt with Nubians as far south as Kenya. So they still exist as a people, very beautiful people. And that is what not only Bible says, but that is what the Greek historian also says, that they were tall, smooth skinned, and very beautiful individuals. These are the funerary statues of the 5 emperors of Nubia that existed. So the 25th empire lasted through 5 pharaohs and then disappeared. Later on, the empire lasted for 100 years. But in that 100 years, close to 100 years, they had a big impact. But the map also shows there's a theory that was pushed from the first time that the French entered Egypt, that the French set the time when the Egyptian empire existed and set the race that existed in Egypt. And in fact, there's the stories of the French soldiers shooting off the nose of the Sphinx because the nose was too broad and it would not match the story that needed to be told. So the same when it comes to languages. There's a perception that Semitic languages came from east to west and entered Africa. And like my colleague Scott says, we have made the division between Africa and the Middle East. There's a bridge between the two, and no one saw it as Africa and the Middle East. It was a bridge that people freely crossed from east to west and west to east. And the Semitic, today we don't speak of Semitic and Hamitic languages. We speak of Afro-Asian languages. And the Afro-Asian languages actually begin exactly where the Nubian people come from. It says that these were people that came from the west as the Sahara Desert basically shrunk. They came from the west to the east, and from there the language grew to the east and to the north. When Sheikh Dayub, almost 60, 70 years ago, proposed this, people laughed at him. Today, it is the accepted model that the Semitic languages actually come out of Africa, and that the Semitic and Hamitic languages is a continuation of languages that move from north to south and from west to east into the Levant. And so the spread of the Nubian people and the language is basically an expression of that. So the peaceful relationships fostered during the reign of Ahaz and Judas continued after Hezekiah came on the throne. You can switch to the next slide, please. this just gives you, that is the most famous of all the, and I do not know why history books insist on not saying just a pharaoh. They must say that it is a black pharaoh. So this is the most famous of the pharaohs, and you can see the features. And on the other side is Sennacherib. So this is Tarko, the last of the 5 pharaohs, and on the other side is Sennacherib. These two will at some point clash. You can go to the next slide. Here's the 3 pharaohs, the last 3 pharaohs of the Nubian empire. And you can see the middle one, Shabak II, wearing the united crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. So normally you would see this as a red and a white crown, the white crown on the inside and the red crown on the outside. And what is unique about the Egyptian pharaohs, about the Nubian pharaohs, where the Egyptian pharaoh wears only 1 cobra on his headdress, you can see that they wear 2 cobras. That there's 2 cobras on their headdress, and that distinguishes the Nubians from the Egyptians to the north. Okay, another slide. That is some of the funerary art from Egypt. What does Moses say to Pharaoh? We can't form a religious practices in front of you, because in essence, you're not like us slaughtering your gods. And so both the Egyptians and the Nubians worshipped, as you can see, a ram. And the reason for the ram is that they say the endurance of the ram, always ready to fight, always the ability to endure, and the cobra very much the same. They were a very military, militaristic culture. Next slide. So here we can see that the Nubians dominated not only the south of Egypt, but dominated Egypt right up into the steppes of the Levant. And not only did they rule, but they prospered because they were renowned builders as well. So we'll see from the stele and the likes that they built quite lots of the temples and basically recaptured ancient Egyptian culture. The next slide. So now we come to King Hezekiah. Says the peaceful relationship fostered during the reign of Ahaz between Judah and Assyria continued with Hezekiah. When he came to the throne, Hezekiah became king in 727 before the Common Era, and the policy of fealty to Assyria was maintained. It was only after the death of Sargon II in 705, when Sennacherib became king of Assyria, that Hezekiah rebelled against Assyria. So it was not only King Hezekiah. It seemed that every time a king died from Assyria, that many of its vassal states would rebel. Then the next king runs around trying to basically crush the rebellion. We are told in the Bible that it was Hezekiah's faith and righteousness that saved Jerusalem. The Bible in 2 Kings introduces us to Hezekiah in this way. In the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began his reign. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke the pieces of the Nashetun, the bronze snake Moses had made. For up to that time, the Israelites had been burning incense to it. Hezekiah trusted the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. He was fast to the Lord and did not stop following him. He kept the commandments the Lord had given Moses, and the Lord was with him. He was successful in whatever he undertook. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. So we see what it says in essence. It is implying that Jerusalem was saved because of Hezekiah's righteousness. But it also says that Hezekiah rebelled. Let's see what his rebellion brings. This is a picture. I'll explain this slide now to you. It seems from the biblical text that all Hezekiah's actions from the time of being crowned king of Judah was geared towards a revolt. His religious, political, and economic reforms and the political alliances were preparation for the revolt against Assyria. He firstly initiated religious reforms. He reversed the adulterous practice of his father Ahaz in Ahaz's era, and that is explained in Chronicles. He repaired the temple. His father had shut the doors, basically nailed the doors shut of the temple. So he repaired the temple. He fostered unity between Judah and the remnant of Israel. He actually invited Israel to come and celebrate Pesach with him. According to the Talmud, he promoted Torah studies, and that is described in Sanhedrin 94b. Proof of Hezekiah's religious reforms have been excavated in Tel Beersheba, where magnificent horned altar hewn for the Ashetar, forbidden under Jewish law in Exodus 22, was found dismantled and incorporated into a wall. Hezekiah is also known for his prayers and pleas to Hashem. And I think his most famous, and specifically people from the Christian tradition, will quote his three prayers virtually off by heart. So next, Hezekiah turned to finding Hezekiah turned to his foreign policy, which caused tension later and split with the prophet Isaiah, who was prophesying at that time and actually was his mentor and his support, who vehemently opposed the rebellion, either rebellion or surrender. Isaiah was particularly incensed with Judah's anti-Assyrian alliance with Egypt and Babylon, as well as the fortification of Jerusalem. The Bible reports as a result of Isaiah's despair, he went naked and barefoot for 3 years. Although the Rambam says that it's not true, that is just an explanation of how upset he really was. Proof of the close relation with Egypt is found in Hezekiah's bulla. I just want to explain this particular slide. Hezekiah's first contact in his rebellion is actually with the king of Babylon, who managed to escape Syria twice. And Hezekiah fell sick, but the Bible tells the story out of sequence. It says that Hezekiah fell sick later on. It is at this time in the rebellion, before the siege of Jerusalem, that he falls sick. And when he recovers, the king of Babylon visits him. And so what is Hezekiah's sin? Hezekiah walks around and shows him all the treasure. He shows him the treasure, the treasure in the temple and the likes. And this is what upset Isaiah in such a big way. And Isaiah prophesies then that this will spell the doom of your next generation. And what is, and in fact, your life has come to an end. And just recently, Prophet myself spoke about this very same matter. Hezekiah is lying on his bed He's about to die. He sobs, but then he turns to the wall and in a silent prayer prays to God to basically extend his life for another 15 years. And Isaiah walks back and said, God has extended your life. And this is what this picture is about. But the king of Babylon, basically what Isaiah is saying is, did Nebuchadnezzar later on raid Jerusalem because the legend of the wealth of Hezekiah was known to them through this king of Babylon. Next slide. So lastly, Hezekiah, knowing that Assyria would lay siege on Jerusalem, prepares for the siege by extending and reinforcing the city walls. And here we can see that the walls are up to 5 meters thick. They still exist in Jerusalem. So he broke down the houses and extended the city. He broke down the houses and extended the city because he took in a remnant. In fact, Jerusalem grew by 3 times the remnant from Israel. But he also fortified the walls, 5 meter thick walls, very difficult to penetrate. He stored food, as is clear by the numerous earthenware that is found with Hezekiah's seal stating for the king. He covered the spring and built a tunnel to funnel water to the inner city whilst hiding the spring in case the Assyrians came. So we know that, and there you can see the tunnel. Basically, for me, from an engineering background, it is a feat of engineering because on the tunnel is a plug, basically celebrating the fact that they dug the tunnel from 2 different directions and actually met right in the middle at the same time. And that spring, that tunnel still exists today. You can walk through it. Okay. Next slide. Okay, this is a little out of sequence, but I'll cover this now. Hezekiah was now ready to face the might of Egypt. With the background, we now turn back to the question, why did Assyria, after having conquered the entire Levant and was standing at the gates of Jerusalem, suddenly leave? Well, our Bible states that the angel of death killed 185,000 Assyrians and the survivors fled Assyria, never to return again. King Sennacherib has a different version, obviously, to this, and this is what is carved on this particular Sphinx. Is carved at the bottom of the Sphinx is the story of the attack on Jerusalem. And he says, as for Hezekiah the Jew, he did not submit to my yoke. He also says that I shut Hezekiah up in Jerusalem like a caged bird, and that the Judean king then submitted and paid vast tribute, 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver, gems, jewels, large carnelians, ivory inlaid couches, ivory inlaid chairs, elephant hides, elephant tusks, ebony boxwood, and all kinds of valuable treasures, as well as his daughters, his harem, his male and female musicians, while he had brought after me to Nineveh, my royal city. So that is what Sennacherib has carved on there. So Sennacherib said, in essence, that Hezekiah bribing, that's why he left. But he makes it clear he did not penetrate, as Isaiah prophesies. Not an arrow would be shot, not a wall would be breached. Jerusalem will stand. So the Bible confirms what Sennacherib says, and that Hezekiah paid him a large bribe, even ripping off the gold-covered doors of the temple to pay Sennacherib. But that did not appease Sennacherib, as the Bible also makes clear. And we have to assume that there was another reason that persuaded Sennacherib to leave to Syria. The other theories that abound, and that include that maybe an epidemic leveled the Assyrians. Maybe some disease broke out. Maybe it was dysentery or any other possible causes. Paul, as a doctor, you may know, drinking contaminated water or the likes. That maybe there was a crisis somewhere else in the kingdom, and maybe another uprising, and Sennacherib left. And that was the reason why he did not invade. Another one suggests that King Hezekiah simply surrendered, causing Sennacherib to spare the city and to spare him too. Yet another is that Sennacherib's mother was a Judean princess named Atalia, from the same royal house as Hezekiah, and Jerusalem was spared because they were related. So we don't know, and that is one of the latest ones that is being explored. The historian Herodotus has another version of this. He says that, in essence, that Assyria, that Turkey, the Egyptian Nubian pharaoh, fled back towards Egypt, and the Assyrians pursued them. But when they entered Egypt, there was mice that ate all the leather straps, basically ate everything there, their armor, all the leather in the armor and the likes. And because of that, they were stuck in the desert. And again, from a Western point of view, I see you laughing. From a Western point of view, people say when the ancients speak about mice, it is normally a sign of a plague, and more normally the bubonic plague that is carried by mice, and maybe that is the reason. And the reason why the bodies aren't found is that it never happened in or around Jerusalem. It happened closer to the Egyptian border, where Sennacherib lost his troops. But for me, maybe the answers in the text. Scholars generally agree that 2 Kings is heavily reducted with later inserts. An example is 2 Kings 19, verses 19, 2 Kings chapter 19 to, or verses 19 to 35. It is a late theologically motivated insertion that disrupts the story flow. If the chunk of the text is removed, the Cushite role is much clearer. And what does it say? It says that in Kings 18:17 to 19.9, it says that Sennacherib, the Syrian emperor, will hear, report, a rumor, and return to his land. And then 2 verses later, Sennacherib hears a report that Tarko, the Nubian prince, has set out to fight. The natural follow-up when the inserted text is removed is that Sennacherib leaves. But it seems, as with a lot of Bible texts, so what was the benefit? Why is it that Judaism stood? That the Israelites were more prolific writers than the Judeans, and they brought the text with them when they fled Israel. And that text was worked on by the Judeans in that 100 years leading up to exile, and specifically Kings and Chronicles and Isaiah was written and heavily redacted at that time, because each one, why is it that these 3 books repeat the same story over with slight differences? Each one was meant to send a different message to those, the exiles that are returning, to those that must keep steady in their faith, that they must not make the same mistake as Hezekiah did. In fact, our tradition tells us that Hezekiah had the potential of becoming the Mashiach. But what does our tradition tells us? Why did he not become the Mashiach? Because he could not sing as well as his ancestor David. He did not sing the praises of God. And for that reason, he did not become the Mashiach. So we can see that it was heavily redacted and changed to suit the needs of the day. So in the 20 years after 701, Sennacherib did not again set foot in the Levant. During the same period, can you just move to the next slide? Before I go on, I want to show you this and the influence in terms of Egypt. On this side here, you can actually see Hezekiah's seal. And what do you see? What do you see in that seal? You see a winged being, a beetle in essence. Can you move? And you can see on that side is a stele from the Kushites, and you can see very much in the top a winged being, basically a beetle on top. And why the beetle? It is the dung beetle. And the Egyptians worship the dung beetle because the dung beetle can find the sun and it moves, and it comes from the tradition that basically the Egyptian god moved the sun across the sky by rolling it in exactly the same way that the dung beetle does. And to show that the Judean culture had a close link to Egypt, you can see the bulla, the seal of Hezekiah. And this one particularly is on the storage jugs, the storage pots that when he was building up the stores ready for the siege, they would put that stamp on these containers to say, for the king. Can you move the slide? So there's, in the center, is Hezekiah's personal seal. And you can see that there's the shape of the dung beetle again, the winged beetle, and what does our tradition tell us? How do they wave this away? Because this was only discovered fairly recently. This was only discovered fairly recently in the last 6 or 7 years. And how do they wave it away? Say, well, there's many references where God is referenced as the sun. So there's nothing untoward in terms of this. This is not inherited from the Egyptians, and it's no way that we are adopting Egyptian culture, but rather that we're utilizing a similar symbol to express our belief in God. But that would be fine. But you can see on either side of Hezekiah's seal is the Ankh, the sign of life. So there's an Ankh on either side, and written in Paleo Hebrew. Basically, it says Hezekiah, son of Ahaz. King Hezekiah, son of Ahaz. And on this side here, you can see the Nubian sign of the beetle. So you can see more clearly what is actually expressed on Hezekiah's seals. Okay. Okay, so unfortunately, some of the pictures are out of sequence, but on the one side is Sennacherib after he destroyed Lachish, and he's pointing to Jerusalem, I'm on my way, and he sent a letter to Hezekiah, and that is Hezekiah. It says Hezekiah took the letter, he threw it on the temple floor, and he bowed and prayed. And that is one of the reasons why Hezekiah is so famous, is for his prayers. Like I say, another traditions that is an offshoot of Judaism, they basically memorize these prayers. Next slide. So how do we know Sennacherib's story and what happened to Hezekiah? There's a prism that is found, and on that prism is the entire tale that is recorded. And this is basically some of the reliefs bas reliefs on the walls showing what it did in Lachish. And why is it that I come back to Lachish? Because when they dug up in Lachish to show that there was a link between the Egyptians and the Jews at the time, they found the skeletons of Lachish in Lachish, and the skeletons, the DNA proves that they were Nubians. There was Nubians amongst the people in Lachish. So it means that the trading was so close between Judah and Egypt that the Nubians were actually living amongst them. But that is not unusual. We know that even as far back as King David, that that the message that comes back that his general has died in the battlefield is brought by a Nubian. So there's always been a close link with the Levant and the Nubian culture. In fact, there's lots of references. There's over 56 references to Nubia, and all of them in the Bible are positive. So if there was any negative aspect, or if they did lose in this battle, it would not have been reflected in positive light. So in the 20 years, the dynasty was known in the post-era of, so we assume that Sennacherib, when he heard the news of the Nubian king at the time, who later became the Nubian and Egyptian pharaoh, Tarko, was on his way to attack him, that Sennacherib packed up and left because he knew the military prowess of the Nubians, and that is how it is stated. But there's another story in a city before he conquers Lachish, where Sennacherib boasts. He said, I did come up against the Egyptians with the thousands, hundreds of thousands of chariots, and I defeated them. And history is divided in this. Some say that the Nubians won, and others say that Sennacherib won. So maybe that score was even, but it still does not explain why later on he chooses to leave when he hears that Tarko is on his way with his Nubian and Egyptian soldiers at the end of the day. Can you move the last slide? So there is some truth in what Sennacherib says, that he did capture Nubians, most probably at Lachish, because this is the reliefs in Lachish, and you can see the Nubians hung and strung up. He treated them very cruel because they were the ones that resisted. And you can see the Nubians because they're the one with the clean faces, and all the Semitic people had bearded faces, long hair, and you can see the unique style of the Nubians with a single feather. Many thousands of years later, that is how King Shaka is recognized as well on the battlefield with a big shield and the long feather in his hair. Okay, so who then slaughtered Sennacherib's men? Well, I think the jury is out there. My opinion, and there was a very famous book written more than 25 years ago that discussed this, and it became a big talking point. And 20 years later, they brought 8 of the greatest biblical scholars together and posed the same question. And out of the 8, 6 agreed that it must have been the Nubians. One said absolutely no, and one sat on the fence. So if it went for a vote, the majority win, it would have said that Sennacherib was defeated by the Nubian Pharaoh Tarko. Thank you very much.
everyone. I'm sorry I can't be with you tonight. I am in cold and rainy Cape Town instead. This presentation is one that I first gave 12 years ago. It's the first presentation I ever gave at Beit Emanuel, and it turned into 3 presentations. This is a much shortened version. And since I suspect it's rather late listening to this, I will start immediately. We go back to the Sinai Desert in the 1840s, where one Reverend Charles Foster is one of a group of Victorian Protestant ministers of the era who were convinced that the new science of archaeology would prove the literal truth of the Bible that he set out to find. In particular, he was interested in searching for evidence of Moses and the wandering Jews. And he found some rocks in the middle of the desert covered with strange writing. And he realized this strange writing was a crude copy of Egyptian hieroglyphics made by people who didn't understand hieroglyphics. He wrote a number of books in which he talked about his travels in what he called Arabia and the patriarchal evidence of revealed religion that he had found. His argument was that only Jews would live in the Howling Desert. These are people who had seen Egyptian writing, perhaps when they were slaves. He pointed to that famous story in the Bible in which Moses strikes the 2 rocks and water gushes forth, getting him into a lot of trouble with God, but he reckoned he had found those rocks. Now, Charles Foster was almost right with this theory, which unfortunately made him very, very wrong. So we have to fast forward through another 150 years of different discoveries and different theories to get to what we currently believe, which is this. Writing was invented many times over, all over the world, but the alphabet, the one that we use today, was invented only once. And what Charles Foster struck upon in the desert was the earliest example of that alphabet. Now, ancient writing tended to take the form of icons. In other words, there was one symbol and represented one idea. In other words, to take Chinese, for example, writing, we have here a symbol which means man running, and there we have a symbol which says many men writing. In an alphabet, one symbol equals one sound, which means that in a Chinese script, you need about 6,000 characters to cover all the necessary bases, whereas with an alphabet like Hebrew, well, they only have 23 letters. Clearly, one is far, far easier to learn than the other. Now, modern technology has dated these early samples that Foster discovered to around 1800 to 1400 years before the Christian era, which probably knocks out Moses, who is generally thought to date to around 1200 before the Christian era. In other words, 200 to 600 years later. And yet, nonetheless, there's a puzzle. They can be found in the same form scribbled all over a sphinx at Serabat al-Qadim, and in all sorts of places in what is today modern Israel, Shechem, Lachish, and Gezer, all the same symbols scribbled on rocks and so on. So the current theory is this. They were the work of Semitic slaves who were mining turquoise in the desert. Turquoise is an extremely valuable commodity for the Egyptian pharaohs because they used it, as you can see, in their gold masks and the like. Turquoise has for centuries been associated with royalty, the royal color. And the theory is that the people who were doing all this were the tribe called the Midianites. The Midianites were, in the opinion of the Bible, also children of Abraham, descendants of Midian, who was a somewhat obscure son of Abraham from one of the lesser wives, but nonetheless a child of Abraham. And Moses, when he fled Egypt, lived among the Midianites and was looked after by them. And his father-in-law was Jethro, a Midianite priest, and who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. In other words, Moses was married into the Midianites. It was a rather friendly relationship between the Israelites and the Midianites seemed to come to an abrupt end when the Exodus took the Israelites into the promised land, at which point they got into conflict with the Moabites and the Midianites. A very complicated story emerges in which the Israelites, after having been variously duped, managed to kill off all the Midianite men, leaving behind only the women, and they share out amongst themselves 32,000 Midianite virgins for themselves as wives, which means, of course, that all of us here are not only descendants of the ancient Israelites, but also descendants of those 32,000 Midianite women, which brings us much closer to that alphabet. Now, all subsequent alphabets are based upon that original alphabet from 3,800 years ago. Now, it is generally known as the Phoenician alphabet, implying that it was the Phoenicians who created it. But actually, the reason is that it's the Phoenician traders are the ones who brought it into Europe. Because the alphabet, as Foster discovered, actually started much further south in the Sinai and then slowly spread north from the Midianites to the Moabites to the Israelites to the other Canaanites, finally reaching the Phoenicians, who are up in what is today Lebanon, who, being great seafarers and traders, took it across to Europe to the Etruscans, the Greeks, the Romans. And it began as a crude imitation of Egyptian hieroglyphics. So to give an example, on the left is a hieroglyphic of an ox, and next to it, which looks rather like a rabbit, a frightened rabbit, is a Semitic drawing of an ox. And an ox in Hebrew or other Semitic languages is called Aleph. So the Semitic ox gradually became simplified into that kind of very simple form, which the Etruscans flipped over and the Greeks flipped over even more, and they called it Alpha, and the Romans created the elegant A that you're accustomed to. Or there's this shape, which is a house in Egyptian hieroglyphics. On the right is the house. It's crudely drawn on the rocks. And a house is called Beit. And in Semitic languages, that Egyptian house turns into something like that. The Etruscans turned it around, the Greeks turned it around further, and the Romans turned it around further, and we have what the Greeks called beta, and the Romans would have called B. And then we have a throwing stick, which is an ancient weapon, which was called a gimel. And there's a Semitic, the Etruscan, the Greek, and the Roman versions of what the Greek called gamma. And we can carry on. There's a fish. It looks like a filleted hake, but it's a fish. And that fish is called dalet. And there's the Semitic, the Etruscan, the Greek, and the Roman versions of a letter the Greeks called delta. And so on. Head equals rosh. Go through the list and you end up with the letter R. I equals iron. Go through the different letters and you end up with O. Water equals mime. That zigzag to represent the waves in the water turns eventually into the letter M. Palm equals cuff. The fingers on the hand turn into the letter K. Now, in the original writing, as you would already have seen from Foster's Rocks, there was no sense that you had to write neatly in lines. People wrote the letters, and then they wrote over the letters, and they wrote in any particular direction, one on top of the other. The idea that you had to keep it in lines would not occur for many centuries. Then when it did occur, what you had was called apostropheden, which means writing following the plow, which is the only example they had. In other words, you started off from the left and you went to the right, and then you turned the oxen and the plow around, and then you went back again, backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards. That was the model they used, and that was the model they used for writing. It took the Phoenicians to make their most significant input when they decided to put all the lines facing in the same direction, in their case from right to left, which the Greeks flipped on its head and turned into writing from left to right. Now, in the original alphabet of the Semites, all of the Semites, there were no vowels at all. It took the Greeks to realize the need for vowels and to add them in. Those vowels do not occur in the Semitic languages. And it took many centuries before people realized the need for gaps between words and lines, because when you speak, there are no gaps between your words and your sentences. And it wasn't until the Middle Ages that punctuation was even invented. Punctuation was invented when people became less and less confident of the original writing and needed simplification in the form of telling them when to stop and when to go. And nobody ever read silently. This was an oral culture in which when you read aloud, as if you were reading to other people, even if you were sitting all by yourself. So fine, we have this alphabet, and we know that the Phoenicians are credited wrongly with having invented it. But how do we know that the Israelites were using this alphabet? Well, for example, we have something called the Zayit stone, which is a huge boulder that looks like that, scratched with letters that you can hardly see here, but if you look over here, you can see much more clearly what those letters actually look like. Now, the Zayit stone represents the oldest ever Hebrew text that we managed to find. It is a huge boulder with a hollow in it. It was probably used as a mortar for mortar and pestle. It was found 50 kilometers south of Jerusalem. It dates to 1,000 years before the Christian era, and it consists only of repetitions of the alphabet, suggesting that it was being scratched onto the rock by someone who was learning the alphabet and was writing it down in a slightly different order to what we would use today, either because they had them in this different order in those days or because this person didn't know the correct order. And then there is Ketef Hinnom, which is a burial cave or cemetery in Jerusalem in which 2 silver amulets were found, 2 silver amulets rather similar in appearance to the mezuzah you have on your door, and like the mezuzah on your door, containing prayers rolled up inside, in this case inscribed on silver foil. It took several years for the scientists, the archaeologists, to delicately unroll the silver foil, which looked like that, to discover that it dated back to about 650 years before the Christian era, predating the Babylonian exile of the Jews, and it contained the priestly blessing prayer in identical form to today's version, making it the oldest Hebrew texts that match the Bible. Now, that's what it looks like, the priestly blessing in its modern form on the left-hand side there, and on the right-hand side, how it looks in those silver pieces of silver foil, the pink representing the letters that have been lost. And then there is the Shiloah inscription, as it's known, dating back to 700 years before the Christian era. And the Shiloah inscription, which looks like that, was found in the 19th century during the Ottoman era, which is why it is currently in the Istanbul Museum, not the Tel Aviv Museum or Jerusalem Museum, a cause of great resentment between the Israeli government and the Turks who refused to return it. Now, the rock is an extremely extensive piece of writing, and it describes the building of Hezekiah's Tunnel, a very famous tourist attraction in Europe, in Jerusalem, that you may have seen, which essentially was a tunnel designed to funnel water from a spring outside Jerusalem into Jerusalem in case water was needed during a siege. And famously, the tunnel was created by diggers working from opposite sides, working together, listening to the sound for the sound of the digging on the other side, finally managing to meet up in the middle, which is where the rock was placed as a kind of memorial explaining how that tunnel was created. Now, you may well be finding all of this rather puzzling, because what about the Hebrew alphabet that you were taught, that you read all the time? It doesn't look anything like this. And the answer is, there's the new alphabet, there's the old alphabet, that the square Hebrew alphabet that we're accustomed to today is not actually the Hebrew alphabet. It was introduced during the Babylonian exile of the Jews by Ezra the scribe, who's generally credited in the Bible and by historians as the man who put the Bible together. And it is actually based on a script which was at the time the official script of the Persian Empire. The script is indeed based on our Semitic alphabet, but you can see that it's taken a very different form. So on the top is our ancient Semitic alphabet. In the middle is the current printed alphabet that you would be familiar with. And at the bottom is the handwriting version of modern Hebrew script. And what is interesting is that the handwritten version, unlike handwriting in almost any other alphabet, is quite significantly removed in its appearance from the printed text, and indeed bears a much greater resemblance to the original Semitic alphabet, suggesting that these echoes were remembered. And indeed, this is not a big surprise because the Talmud knows the whole story. So here we have Talmud Sanhedrin 21b and this story. Originally, the Torah was given to Israel in Ivri letters, meaning the ancient Hebrew letters, and in the sacred language. Later, in the time of Ezra, the Torah was given in the Ashurit script, meaning the square script, and the Aramaic language. Finally, they selected for Israel the Ashurit script and the Hebrew language, leaving the Ivri characters and the Aramaic language for the commoners. Who are the commoners? Rav Chisda said the Kuthites or Samaritans. What is Kitav Ivri? Rav Chisda said Libona script, meaning Lebanese script, in other words, Phoenician script. And indeed, these Cushites or Samaritans do indeed have a script which bears a much closer resemblance to the original than does the square Hebrew type. So, we had the alphabet, we had it very early. Where is the original Torah? And the answer is not a single ancient Torah has survived, not one. A cynic would say, oh yeah, does this mean there never were any ancient Torahs? After all, if we were to look at the Sumerians and the Assyrians and the Hittites and so on, whose civilizations were much, much older, 5,000 years and more, we have huge numbers of written documents from them. We have the entire Gilgamesh epic, for example. We have the entire law books and so on. Why is that? And the answer is because they wrote in cuneiform form on clay tablets. And tablets can survive wars, tablets can survive fires, tablets can survive burial, tablets can survive rats. Torahs, on the other hand, were made of parchment. So what is parchment? It is cow skin. The great advantage of cow skin is that it is light and flexible, easily carried, and it can be glued together to make for very long texts, including, for example, the Hebrew Bible. The problem is it is very fragile. It can't survive damp and rain, humidity, fire, burial, getting old, or being eaten by rodents. Nonetheless, what has survived, just as in the Sumerians, Assyrians, etc., are clay clues to many hundreds of lost Torahs. The clay bulla, as they were called, were used to seal the Torahs, and enormous numbers of them have been found, some of them inscribed with the names of scribes whose names appear in the Bible itself. And then there are coins. Coins also survive long era, and these Hasmonean era coins, Maccabean era coins, are inscribed not with the new alphabet, but with the original alphabet. As to Torahs, the only surviving Torahs, the oldest of them, were the Dead Sea Scrolls, which had no impact whatsoever on the evolution of Judaism because they were only found by chance in 1946. So they consist of some 15,000 scrolls, some of which date back to 300 before the Christian era, an absolutely massive library. And the question is, was it hidden away after the destruction of the temple? Now, the question is, why did those Torahs survive when none others did? And the answer is, Qumran is very arid, very low humidity. These scrolls were hidden very deep inside caves with low airflow, and many of the scrolls that are best preserved were sealed inside clay jars. The significance became apparent when those scrolls were first found, which is that for the first few years they were treated very carelessly, as a result of which they very rapidly decayed and a lot of information was lost or fragmented. In other words, the moment these scrolls are exposed to the atmosphere, they rapidly deteriorate. Now, one of those scrolls is called the Leviticus scroll, the entire book of Leviticus. It was discovered in cave number 11. There were a great many caves. It dates back to 200 years before the Christian era, and it is written entirely in the old script. And indeed, even among the scrolls, most of them which are written in the more modern square script, the name of God is often written in the original script. Now, the arrival of writing so long ago actually changed the culture of the Jewish people, because there are significant cultural differences between an oral tradition in society and a scribal tradition in a society. So, to look first at oral traditions, many of them remain to this day. So, for example, the parashas are read aloud in public. They're not read privately to individuals the way, say, Christians might do it, aloud and in public. And they are chanted. They are not read, they are chanted. And why are they chanted? Because chanting allows you to remember what you're saying. And there's a great deal of use of mnemonics in the prayers that the Jews have, because mnemonics also encourage memory. And another example of the older oral traditions is when, for example, in an Orthodox shul, the silent prayer such as the Amidah is read, it is not really read silently. People stand up and shuffle backwards and forwards and mumble to themselves fairly audibly. You can't make out what they're saying, but you can make out that they're mumbling, and that mumbling goes back to this oral tradition. In the oral tradition, learning equals learn by heart, because nothing is written down. It's either in your head or it's not there at all. As a result of which people have most formidable memories. The ancient people or people from non-literate societies have absolutely staggering memories. The arrival of literacy actually did terrible, terrible things to our memories. In the academies where the sages discussed the Torah amongst themselves, it was entirely oral, the oral tradition. Nothing was written down. It was all discussion. And if they wanted to consult a passage in Torah, they beckoned to a group of people called Tanaim, who were blind people who, as a result of their blindness, had even more impressive memories and were capable of learning the entire Torah flawlessly off by heart, and formed a kind of instant feedback book on the Torah. But to literacy, the early shift from an oral to a written culture changes the way people think, or at least the way literate people, the leadership, think. So to explain, In an oral culture, you hear the message. It comes in through your ears. It comes in from all sides into your ears, not from any one particular direction. In a scribal culture, the message comes in through your eyes. You see the message, it is in front of you, it comes from only one direction. As a result, there's a difference in oral and scribal messages. Oral messages are very fleeting. You speak and it's gone. Scribal messages are fixed onto that piece of paper and it stays there, and you can read it later, you can read it years later, you can read it centuries later. Oral messages are very personal because you can only speak to people who are within your immediate hearing. Scribal messages are impersonal because they can go to anyone, including people you have never met. Oral messages are very local. You have your little local circle of people you speak to. Scribal messages can go all over the globe, anywhere. And oral messages are for the instant right now, whereas scribal messages can be forever. So in an oral culture, people are immersed in the sound of the messages, and that encourages a belief in magic and a belief in holism, meaning that everything is connected to everything else. Whereas in a scribal culture, you tend to see things in neat, straight lines. In logic, B follows A, and in categories, this category on top of that category, on top of that category, separated. So a modern example of oral culture, just to make clear what I'm talking about, is the telling of jokes. So somebody tells you a joke, you think it's very funny, and you decide to repeat it to other people. And when you do so, you need to be very faithful to the fundamental structure of it, the plot line, and of course the punch line. But you can tell that joke in your own words. You can spice it up in your own words. There are some people who are much better than other people at telling jokes. In other words, it is not important what the individual words are. It is important what the general theme of the joke is. And that is never the case in a written culture where every word counts. Just as Charles Foster believed that every word in the Bible was true and could be proved by science, the written word encourages the notion of truth and the idea of laying down rules, the idea of laws, the idea that words can be unchanged over time, the idea that there can be words that are perfect or texts that can be perfect. There are words that can be used to hold people to account. And if you add all of that together, what you get is Judaism. Written word also encourages the notion of the perfect original text, the infallible perfect original text. And that is the central dogma of Orthodox Judaism. Today's Torah is an absolutely perfect copy of the Torah handed down to Moses at Sinai. Now, that's a tall order. And to make sure that the Torah handed down to Moses and the modern Torah are identical in every form, a set of very demanding scribal rituals emerged to make sure that there were never any mistakes, and those scribal rituals are still in use unchanged to this day. Essentially, a scribe, which is, or sofer, which is a profession, has to do everything himself. He can trust nothing to anyone else. He must make the parchments, he must make the ink, he must make the quills, he must make the wrappings. And in all of this, he may not use any metal tools because metal tools are associated with war. So, as a matter of interest, how many cows make for one Torah? 80 cows. How many letters are there in a Torah? 304,805. How many hours does it take to write a Torah? 2,000 hours, which would be about a year, a little more, a little less, depending on how speedy the scribe happens to be. So what he does first is he prepares parchment. There can be no blemishes at all. Firstly, he soaks the skin in lime water. He stretches it over a frame. He scrapes it and sands it to make it completely smooth and white. Then he cuts it into large rectangles of a specific size. He scores it with a stylus made from reeds into 3 columns with 43 horizontal lines to fit 42 lines of text. He then makes his own ink from an ancient formula from powdered nuts, gum arabic, copper sulfate crystals. The ink is designed to have maximum blackness. He only makes tiny amounts of ink at a time because he must always use fresh ink. Then he prepares the quill. The quill has to be made out of goose feathers. There's a specially cut nib on the feather. He has to cut a great many quills because they do not last very long. After a few letters, he needs another quill. Then, before he begins to write, he visits the mikveh and he prays for guidance in his holy task. He then has to test the quill and ink by writing on another sheet of scrap parchment the word Amalek and immediately blotting it out in accordance with the command to blot out the name Amalek. And then finally, he starts writing. And he may make no errors. He may not write from memory. He has to check each letter with a tikkun, which is a written correction guide, and he has to pronounce each word out loud before writing it. Should he actually make an error, well, certain errors can simply be scraped off if he spots it immediately. But if he makes an error writing the name of God, the entire sheet must be buried in a geniza because the name of God may not be erased. To make life even trickier, certain of the letters are topped with crowns. These crowns which look rather like daggers. You can have 3 little daggers on a letter or 1 little dagger on a letter, are specific to sacred texts. They don't occur in any other form of writing, and they make the whole thing even more complicated. And all sorts of meanings are ascribed to when certain letters have crowns, or they don't have crowns, or they have 1 crown. Very complicated. Also, even the shape of malformed letters from a long-lost original are preserved. In other words, there are some letters which are bigger than the rest of the letters in the word, and there are some letters that are smaller than the other letters in the word and slightly raised. And there are even letters where a scratch in the original letter is preserved. That's how carefully the originals are followed. And the text has to be set justified. Justified means that both sides of the columns have to neatly line up. Now, that's something you can do very easily On your computer in your Microsoft Word processor, you can just tell the computer to neatly line up the columns on both sides. But if you are writing, it is incredibly difficult to do. It needs considerable planning and foresight to be able to figure out how those letters are going to fit together to reach a neat end. And you need to subtly change the width of the letters and the width of the spaces to get there. What tends to happen instead is that towards the end of the line, where things are looking tricky, certain letters get extended rather widely to make justification possible, as in over here. Generally, it's considered that the very best scribes need to use the very least stretching of letters like this. The other point about these scrolls is that the lighter the Torah, the smaller the writing, the more valuable the Torah is. And as pointed out before, there's absolutely no punctuation, because punctuation was only invented many hundreds of years later. Thanks to all of this care, the remarkable thing is that modern texts are astonishingly close to the ancient Dead Sea Scrolls in almost every respect, which is a tribute to the care with which they've been done. Now, there are 613 mitzvahs in the Torah, and the 613th mitzvah is that everyone must write a Torah, which in the modern day comes to everyone should pay for a Torah, and you can hold the hand of the scribe as he writes the last letter of the Torah in your favor. Thank you very much.
So this feels very strange, but Owen, if you're still logged on, thank you for a really wonderful presentation, which we thoroughly enjoyed. And thank you also to Alistair, and in absentia to Simon. It was a great evening. Thanks, everybody. Laila Tov, good night.